And now we welcome the third T. This is Reverend Dr. Timothy C. Murphy, who is a minister, scholar, activist. He is responsible for the spiritual life of the church at the present time through preaching, teaching, and pastoral care, serving as executive head and administrator of church staff. Prior to accepting the call to serve Plymouth Church as its senior pastor and teacher in August 2018, Timothy was most recently served as transitional pastor of the Church of All Peoples, the Christian church, the All Peoples Christian Church in Los Angeles, California. He previously led Progressive Christians Uniting, a faith and social justice organization based in Southern California. He was executive director for 3 years there, focusing on the areas of mass incarceration and climate change. He has also taught courses at Claremont School of Theology in the areas of religion, ethics, and politics. Timothy is the author of Counter-Imperial Churching for a Planetary Gospel. I'm going to repeat that, so it soaks. Counter-Imperial Churching for a Planetary Gospel. And another book entitled Sustaining Hope in an Unjust World, with the subtitle, How to Keep Going When You Want to Give Up. The title of his paper today is Process-Relational Good News, and welcome, Timothy.
Good afternoon. As this is the final paper before our lunch break, I know there's some energy issues maybe, so I'd like a response to that good afternoon. So let's try that again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. Again, the title for my presentation today is Process-Relational Good News. A number of process scholars have rightly understood that Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy is in many ways a theory of value. Through the process of concrescence, entities become not mere facts, but also values. The interconnected web of becoming leads to an interconnected web of value. During this conference, there's a whole section devoted to facts, values, and reality tomorrow, and I look forward to hearing from its presenters on that theme. However, this is the religious experience and belonging section. So what I'd like to do in this brief presentation is connect Whitehead's theory of value theologically with the Christian gospel. I will do this because I'm convinced that the former is a way to conceptualize the good news, particularly by applying its analysis to liberative efforts where that value is denied as bad news. To foreshadow my conclusion, the good news is the affirmation of value in some context, that all entities are valuable for themselves, for others, and for the whole, and it responds to some situation or system that denies that value in some way. I don't intend to get into the metaphysical weeds here, but suffice it to say that entities are valuable in different ways. For starters, they have intrinsic value in that they are a unique process of intensity and harmonization. Additionally, they also have instrumental value in becoming objects to be felt by other concressing entities. But that potential extends to the whole universe of entities. Even if they are negatively felt, they are part of the larger offering to that whole. In Whitehead's own words, quote, "Everything has some value for itself, for others, and for the whole. This characterizes the meaning of actuality. We have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe. Existence in its own nature is the upholding of value intensity. Also, no unit can separate itself from the others and from the whole, and yet each unit exists in its own right." Unquote. There is occasionally some temptation by process scholars to de-emphasize Whitehead's later work in favor of his magnum opus, Process and Reality. But in this last book, Modes of Thought, he says less technically and more directly what he had been saying for a decade. Existence in its own nature is the upholding of value intensity. And that value intensity is an interrelated process of becoming, connecting everything to each other, but not subsuming anything under an oppressive totalization. This insight is central to my understanding of the gospel or good news as a Christian. I've written previously that theologically, the resulting kerygma or proclamation that comes out of this insight is, quote, "the proclamation of value and importance of all entities, both for themselves and each other. One can love oneself and one's neighbor as oneself because each is valuable, both intrinsically and instrumentally. There are no barren facts," unquote. The claim that the gospel proclamation is an application of this broader metaphysical idea may at first sound arbitrary. What's the connection? Why would anyone consider that to be good news? To answer this valid point, I have to briefly address soteriology, otherwise understood as theories of salvation. As I learned in seminary, there are many different questions that can arise when people think about salvation. They might wonder, when does it happen? Who is it for? How is it achieved? Those are all good questions that are worth exploring. As a congregational pastor, I've had folks young and old wrestle with those questions in confirmation classes and adult education series on salvation. But for those who desire a more basic framework, we can break salvation down to a single phrase. I learned this from Jean Sledham as her teaching assistant at Claremont and the Systemic Theology for Ministry course. It comes down to a two-part question in which essentially all theories of salvation can fit. Saved from what and saved for what? Saved from what and saved for what? Negatively, salvation is in response to some problem, some bad news, in which something needs to be saved from said problem. Positively, it is aiming towards some solution, some good news, in which it will be saved for something affirming. That's as basic as you can get. Save from, save for. I found being able to answer these two related questions is crucial for people to articulate what salvation means for them. From my experience in predominantly progressive Christian communities, much like this congregation space that we are in, most people struggle with salvation. They know what they don't affirm. They know the potential problems that they reject or are no longer compelling. Namely, that your immortal soul is doomed to hell on account of God's judgment unless you take Jesus into your heart. That's not their problem. They've decisively moved away from that. It doesn't work for them. But what does that mean in terms of the gospel? If the answer they have rejected is the problem of Christianity, and that problem no longer resonates with them, does that mean that the gospel does not answer a problem? Is there no problem at all? Or maybe the problem was they used to think that there was a problem, but now they've been freed of it. Without an alternative theory of salvation, a saved from something, then there's no problem to which the gospel offers an answer. Take it or leave it, doesn't really matter, or call you to anything or anyone. But for something to be experienced as good news and be compelling good news, it must address some felt problem. If there's no problem, any potential good news is just information. Take it or leave it, whatever. At this point, you may be wondering, how does this connect with Whitehead's theory of value? Well, over the years, I've noticed a consistent pattern. It's been true in confirmation classes, in educational series, in social justice activism, in organizing, in reading the news and observing problems in our society and larger world. Every example of bad news that I've heard others identify or been able to identify for myself is some instance of one or more pieces of a process-relational theory of value being denied. Someone or something needs to be saved from not being valued for themselves, not being seen as valuable for others, or not being felt as valuable for the whole consistently. Sometimes it's just one of these elements being denied, and sometimes it's a combination of them. This is especially applicable when we have a liberative understanding of what the good news entails. Following folks like Monica Coleman, I found it highly fruitful to combine process and liberative theologies. For me, this is particularly true when it comes to understanding salvation, especially in response to the social evils of power dynamics like racism, classism, militarism, and ecological devastation, taking a note from the new Poor People's Campaign of recent years. Allow me to give a few examples of how I see these elements working. For instance, there might be the bad news of workers being exploited on the job by management, which is seeking to maximize their profits and maintain their decision-making control of labor. Now, it is the case that management sees workers as having instrumental value. They do this by viewing workers as a means to enrich the company and themselves. There is connection there, oh yes, but it is an oppressive connection. What is missing is the recognition that workers also have intrinsic value, which is being ignored through their exploitation. They have rights and needs independent of their profit extraction potential, such as seeking a good quality of life and work that provides agency. Moreover, workers may be socially isolated from the broader community, members of which may not be aware of what is happening, or alternatively, may be numb to their plight. In doing so, the broader community misses how management's exploitation of labor hurts the community as a whole, ignoring how what affects one directly affects all indirectly. Workers are not seen as valuable for the whole. In response to that bad news, they may seek salvation from that exploitation and apathy. Now, looking at an ecological example, the clear cutting of forests to create additional pasture land for domestic animals ignores the instrumental value that trees have in helping to reduce soil erosion, prevent mudslides, and slow climate change by absorbing carbon dioxide. Trees also serve instrumentally in forming essential habitats for creatures that help maintain an ecosystem's biodiversity. All this is separate from the value that they have in themselves, which is also not being respected or honored in the practice of clear cutting. Now, Whitehead argues against plants having a center of experience, unlike animals, but there's some debate on that. They may not have the same kind of centralizing experience, in that they lack a central nervous system, but either trees themselves or their constituent parts enjoy the feeling of the sun's rays. They seek them out. It is intrinsically enjoyable for them, separate from any instrumental use they may have economically or ecologically. Dismissing this is yet another example of the bad news our world needs to be freed, or yes, saved from, that it might instead experience the good news of a stable climate and healthy ecosystems for the next 7 generations and beyond. With more time, I could offer further examples of people struggling with meaning and worth at the end stages of their lives in nursing homes or assisted living facilities, of police violence against black bodies and more broadly people of color, portions of society dismissing gender and sexual orientation diversity, and in the dehumanization done in order to kill one's enemies. Each of these is a denial of value, intrinsic, instrumental, or interrelated in nature. The good news in these situations is countering, verbally and practically, the bad news that denies one or more of the value relationships and affirms the value that has been ignored. As far as I can tell, process-relational good news is always a response to some instantiation of the bad news of value denial on some level. Previously, I've called this application of processes theory of value the planetary gospel. In some ways, it parallels the earlier social gospel movement of the late 19th and 20th century. It does this by overtly naming social injustices and inequities as having a central and not merely tangential relationship with the core good news. By planetary, I imagine the whole network of life and their connections across spaces more so than an abstract globe. It is not simply a macro theory for the whole world, but a description in any contextual place on that earth of a web of interconnected values, specifically addressing where they are denied in the forms of violence, exploitation, marginalization, imperialism, or powerlessness. It can be personal, social, or ecological in its contextual good news. To the extent that we visualize it spatially at all, it is from the ground up and outward, from the perspective in which we find ourselves, more than a top-down global map. Some might ask, theologically, how is this Christian? Christologically, we could say that Jesus of Nazareth, the one whom Christians title as the Christ, reveals this interconnected reality. It's how we can read through a process lens such things as loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. These are all interconnected loves, self, other, and the whole. Moreover, Jesus spoke good news to specific needs where people were devalued, offering them a sense of their worth and pointing to the worth of those they were previously unwilling to relate to. He addressed specific problems of people and proclaimed salvation for those problems. That, at least, is how I justify this articulation of the gospel as thoroughly consistent with the best of the Christian tradition. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to delve more fully into such Christological formulations, but I wanted to at least name it. On the other hand, some might question whether I have unfairly privileged Christianity as having a unique position in this framework. There is, after all, another section of the conference this afternoon discussing religious pluralism and process. To that, all I have to say is that it is not my contention that Christianity has a monopoly on this proclamation of interrelated value. Nor am I seeking to demonstrate a hierarchy here. It is, however, the tradition in which I was raised, am a part of, and am committed to. While I may appreciate and incorporate insights from other traditions, they are not my primary spiritual home or perspective. I am at best a guest. And so it is to Jesus' way of compassion and justice that I prioritize to help more explicitly connect it with process-relational insights. Other traditions do not necessarily talk about salvation nor use the language references of gospel or good news. However, I suspect that they have other frameworks that resonate with the claim that all entities are fact values, having value for themselves, others, and the whole. In conclusion, I'm convinced that the process-relational understanding of how things are valuable is a compelling way to help people articulate a loving and liberative planetary gospel. Moreover, it has innumerable applications in ministry, in religious life, and in the never-ending quest for a more just, peaceful, and compassionate world. It is as diverse as the relationships that are actual or are interesting potentials yet to be felt. If some problems of devaluing are answered and even resolved, the need for that good news will never be complete, because there will be new relationships and values that will be under threat of dismissal and in need of a good word and active steps taken towards affirming those dismissed value relationships. Thus, even as the issues may change, a planetary gospel of value proclamation, wherever those values are being ignored or actively destroyed, will be needed for decades, if not centuries, to come. Thank you.